In films, soldiers of the past often appear in images that feel instantly familiar. They wear gleaming armor, stand in orderly ranks, and step onto the battlefield with burning resolve. Battles unfold quickly, cleanly, and with clear structure. Heroes and enemies are sharply divided. But was the real life of soldiers in history truly like this? In this video, we will explore together the everyday lives of soldiers from earlier times, from the moment they were still ordinary civilians, forcibly conscripted to the point at which they entered war. What they ate, what they wore, what they thought, and what they were forced to endure. Drawing on historical records, why archaeological evidence, why and modern scholarly research, we will compare the image of soldiers in film with the harsh reality they actually faced, not to question the value of films, but rather to understand the real human being who stood behind the armor and the sword. For much of human history, the concept of the professional soldier hardly existed at all. Standing armies, trained over long periods and paid a regular wage, emerged only much later than films often suggest. In most ancient and medieval societies, soldiers were in reality ordinary people, temporarily transformed into bearers of weapons. They could be farmers, accustomed to working the fields, craftsmen living in towns, herders in border regions, or poor labourers with no land of their own. For them, war was not a profession, it was a duty imposed upon them the moment a conflict broke out. In many countries, once a king or a feudal lord declared war, the system of forced conscription was activated. Sleps vatra. Sleps vatra. Villages and communities were required to provide sleps vatra. Sleps vatra. Sleps vatra. A fixed number of men. Sleps vatra, usually based on age, sleps vatra, and physical capacity. Sleps vatra. Sleps vatra. Sleps vatra. Not everyone was physically fit for war. Salapsavatra, Salapsavatra. Yet the standards were often very low. Refusal was nearly impossible. Failure to appear could be seen as disobedience and result in severe punishment, such as beatings, confiscation of property, exile, or even execution. In many cases, these punishments affected not only the individual, but also his family. Films often portray soldiers as well trained, uniformly equipped, and filled with high morale. Historical reality shows, however, that this was rarely the case. Most soldiers received only very brief training. A few weeks were already considered a long time. In times of crisis, training could last only a few days. The focus lay on simple fundamentals: how to handle a weapon properly, how to maintain formation, how to recognize signals, and how to obey commands. Military equipment clearly reflected social inequality. A small minority, usually wealthier soldiers or members of higher classes, could afford metal armor and high-quality weapons. The majority, however, wore little more than thick clothing to soften blows, simple helmets made of leather or cloth, and rough wooden shields. Weapons were often issued only temporarily. They were not tailored to the individual and were frequently old or damaged. After the war, soldiers were required to return their weapons, or they were taken away upon discharge. For these soldiers, war was not associated with lofty ideals. They did not march into battle in search of glory or honor. Instead, war represented a sudden interruption of everyday life. They worried about fields left uncultivated, about failed harvests, about families suddenly deprived of their primary source of labor. Elderly parents, wives, and children often did not know whether they could hope for a return. Even before they ever stepped onto the battlefield, uncertainty had already become an inseparable part of the life of a soldier in earlier times. In films, the story usually revolves around fierce battles, but in the real lives of soldiers of earlier times, combat occupied only a very small part. Most of their time passed in waiting for orders from superiors, waiting for reinforcements or for food supplies, waiting for a confrontation that might happen or might never come at all. These periods could last for weeks, sometimes even for months. Monotony and underlying tension were the most common conditions in the camp. The living conditions of soldiers were usually extremely harsh. There were hardly any solid shelters. Most slept outdoors, in crude tents, or directly on the ground. The ground was damp, cold at night, and burning hot during the day. The weather was beyond their control. Rain left clothing wet for days on end. Cold numbed hands and feet. Prolonged heat caused exhaustion and dehydration. The soldiers' food was meant mainly for survival, not for proper nutrition. Rations usually consisted of hard bread, grain, legumes, or thin porridge. Meat was rare, and when it was available, it was usually salted or dried meat, difficult to digest. Unreliable supply lines forced many units to fend for themselves. Soldiers could go hungry for days at a time. In some cases, they were compelled to plunder the local population in order to survive. Access to clean water was a particularly serious problem. Drinking water was often taken from rivers, streams, ponds, or lakes without any form of treatment. This allowed disease to spread rapidly. Dysentery, typhoid, fever, and intestinal infections were among the most common causes of death. Many soldiers died from illness before they ever reached the battlefield. The death rate from epidemics in the camps was often higher than that from direct combat. Personal hygiene was almost non-existent. Lice, fleas, and other parasites were constant companions. The smell of sweat, infected wounds, and dead animals hung permanently over the camps. Even small injuries could become life-threatening. There were no antibiotics. Medical tools were primitive. An infected cut could lead to gangrene or death. Military discipline was maintained through severe punishment. Whippings, imprisonment, or reduced rations were common measures. Desertion could be punished by public execution, intended to deter others. The greatest fear of soldiers did not come only from the enemy in front of them, but from prolonged hunger, from diseases that could not be cured, and from the uncertainty of whether they would ever return alive. For soldiers of earlier times, everyday life itself was a silent a war against the environment, against their own bodies, and against the fear within. Films are, above all, a form of storytelling, and every story requires a clear structure, a historical film, must have a central figure, for the audience to follow. It needs a clear distinction between good and evil. It needs climaxes, conflict, and an ending. The real lives of soldiers in earlier times do not meet these requirements. History shows that most battles did not unfold according to a clear script. When combat began, smoke and dust from the ground and from weapons obscured vision. The sound of metal striking metal, screams, and pain turned the space into pure chaos. Under such conditions, it was extremely difficult for soldiers to distinguish friend from foe. Flags, horns, and hand signals Elements often seen in films were frequently overlooked in reality or misunderstood. Orders were passed verbally through multiple levels of command. With each transmission, information could be delayed, distorted, or fail to arrive at all. Many soldiers did not know the full picture of the battle. They knew only their immediate task: to hold position, to advance, or to retreat. This uncertainty is difficult for film to portray in full. If it tried, the audience would struggle to follow the narrative and grasp its meaning. Another crucial difference lies in the factor of time. Films compress and condense events. A battle that lasts only a few minutes on screen may be the result of months of preparation, marching, waiting, and endurance. Days filled with hunger, illness, and exhaustion do not create cinematic climaxes, yet they made up the greater part of a soldier's real experience. Beyond the technical demands of storytelling, films are also strongly shaped by the ideas and values of the era in which they are produced. Concepts such as heroism, honor, and loyalty are often constructed according to modern values and projected backward onto the past. Historical research shows, however, that the motives of soldiers in earlier times were largely pragmatic. They went to war out of duty, out of social pressure, out of fear of punishment in the event of desertion, not out of personal hatred for the enemy, and not necessarily out of lofty ideals. Films often avoid portraying this reality because it would weaken the familiar image of the hero held by audiences. Yet this truth does not make soldiers cowardly. On the contrary, it reveals them as ordinary human beings, placed in situations far beyond their control. They did not write history according to their own will. They were carried along by its current. The difference between film and reality therefore lies not in deception, but in the choice of perspective. One tells stories to help people feel more easily. The other shows life as it truly was. Today, when we watch historical films, we often search for a sense of grandeur, great battles, moments when heroes rise in the midst of chaos, symbolic victories. Films help us experience the past in vivid ways, but if we stop there, we risk seeing war as a form of entertainment rather than as a human experience. When we begin to understand the real lives of soldiers from earlier times, our perspective begins to change. War does not mean only victory or defeat. Not only shifting borders or the collapse of dynasties, war means that millions of lives are suddenly interrupted. It is farmers who leave their fields without knowing what the next harvest will bring. It is fathers who leave their families behind, uncertain whether they will ever return. It is young people who march into war before they have even had the chance to understand how the world works. Soldiers of earlier times, upon closer reflection, were not so different from us as we often imagine. They too knew fear. They too were exhausted. They too longed for home during sleepless nights, and they too hoped for something very simple: to survive and to return to a normal life. The greatest difference lies in historical circumstances. Modern people have more choices. We live in societies in which war, at least for many people, is no longer a compulsory duty for every citizen. But that does not mean that we are completely separated from the past. The fundamental human emotions have not changed over time. Fear, hope, and the bond with family are universal experiences. When we recognize this, we can watch historical films with greater clarity, not to criticize or deny their artistic value, but rather to draw clearer distinctions between art created to tell stories and history passed down through fragments of real lives, and to recognize the real human beings behind the armor, the banners, and the battles that have been remembered. This connection helps us not only to understand the past, but also ourselves. It reminds us that history is not the story of extraordinary people, but the story of very ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances. And it is precisely this that makes history feel closer and more human to people today. What we have just examined shows that the real lives of soldiers in earlier times did not match what films so often portray. They were harsher, more complex, and far less glamorous. Films offer us stories that are easy to follow, clear characters, defined roles, moments of dramatic climax. That is the value of narrative art. History, by contrast, provides a much broader frame: scattered lives, incomplete experiences, fates whose outcomes were often never recorded. Only when we place these two perspectives side by side can we approach the past in a more complete way. We can feel the story, and at the same time recognize the real human being behind it. To this day, archaeology and historical scholarship continue to add to these fragments through human remains, weapons, pieces of equipment, but also through letters, diaries, and scattered records. These discoveries are not meant to dismantle old images, nor are they intended to judge the people of the past. Rather, they help us to remember more accurately. For behind every suit of armor preserved in history, there stands not only a heroic deed, but a real human being. A human being who knew fear, who knew hope, who knew exhaustion, and who lived in a world that was never as simple as it appears to us on the screen. This understanding does not make history less compelling. It makes it closer, more human, and more meaningful for people living today.